All right, so as Katie said, I'm Casey Woster. I am the National Register Program Coordinator with the State Historic Preservation Office. This means that the bulk of my job is dealing with the National Register and getting properties listed to it. You could kind of consider me the gatekeeper. I'm the first stop. I'm also a historic preservation specialist, meaning I specialize in the research and care of old buildings. So this is what I do, not just for work, but it's a passion. So diving in, what is the National Register? So the National Register is the official list of historic properties in the United States that are considered worthy of preservation. This language is taken directly from the legislation that authorized this program. The term worthy of preservation is somewhat subjective, something that we consider worthy of preservation here in Wyoming. Out on the East Coast, they tend to, they can have issues with. So it is a little bit subjective. The National Register of Historic Places was created by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. This act came about due to the destruction of large swaths of historic resources, what we now consider historic resources, during the 1950s and 60s. There were multiple programs in place that today we kind of take for granted that were the main drivers of this destruction. These were largely the construction of the interstate system and the City Beautiful movement. Both of these sought to transform blighted urban centers into areas that that people would want to be. But it also was the result of construction of flyways and overpasses as part of the interstate system in East Coast metropolitan centers like Syracuse, New York. The act was created as a reaction to this destruction. The goal of it was the goal of the National Register of Historic Places and the National Historic Preservation Act is to promote and increase the understanding and appreciation for heritage sites and historic properties. It is administered by the National Park Service, but managed by the individual state historic preservation offices, i.e. me. The current numbers, we now have over 600 entries in Wyoming. That's 600 resources that are listed to the National Register. There are actually, I believe the total at the moment is closer to 99,250 entries nationwide. So, what does listing a property to the National Register do? I figured I'd start with these basics since these are the questions that people ask all the time. A listing to the National Register is a form of prestige, of recognition. It is an honorary designation. It promotes awareness of the resource specifically and historic preservation in general. This has the most impact in downtown areas such as the Gillette downtown district. When you have a downtown district, there tends to be more pride taken in those buildings. It's a sense of unity. Things like districts such as that are very, very good for the community. There was a Medicine Bow Lodge was listed to the National Register this summer, and the county made a really big deal out of it. All sorts of promotional events, advertising it. So these are things that help promote history and historic preservation. Listing to the National Register does serve to document the history and the physicality of a property at that moment in time. I add the term at that moment in time because listings tend to not be updated. So many of the lists, we do have listings that were done in the 1970s and 80s that more research is now available to be able to extend the historic significance of those properties, better understanding of how they were used, things like that. So when a nomination is written, that documents the history, the known history at that time, as well as what the building looked like physically at that exact moment. A listing to the National Register also allows for certain rehabilitation projects to be eligible to use the historic preservation tax credit. This is only for income generating properties. A listing can also open up other revenue streams in the form of grants that are administered by the Park Service. What a listing does not do. This is the one that I get the most questions about. The listing of a property to the National Register does not in any way restrict the rights of private property owners. It doesn't stop any alterations. The listing in and of itself doesn't place any constraints on the property. In fact, we have as mentioned, we have over 600 listings to the National Register. One could be a privately owned building, could be torn down tomorrow, and I would have no idea that it happened. So, these are things that the restrictions that people think of are mostly created at the local level by local government, such as a city creating a historic property overlay or moratoriums on the demolition of historic buildings until they can be properly documented. A listing National Register does not require constant consultation with the SHPO. If a private property owner has a building and they want to do something with it, they want to replace the roof, they're more than welcome to call me. I can help advise them on what materials would work best to not only keep the rain out, but also to in a manner that's affordable. But they're under no obligation to do so. The listing does not, in and of itself, make a property difficult to sell, and it does not raise property taxes. What it can do is that if someone has a property that is listed to the National Register and they take great pride in it, the changes that they make to their property to improve it over time may, when the county appraiser comes through, that may affect property taxes, but that's the county, and those improvements can be made not only to historic properties, but to anyone's property. The Listings National Register does not regulate appearance of the property, and it does not require public access. If you have a property that's listed in the National Register, you are under no obligation to open it to public access. This last point actually should be on the previous slide. A listing to the National Register really does not protect a property from any actions taken by governmental agencies. However, it does afford it extra consideration. An example is any kind of highway project that involves federal funding, any kind of road construction project, they have to take into account the impacts that project will have to a property. Now, you don't have to be listed to have that consideration. Simply any property that our office deems eligible for the National Register, then they have to consider the impacts. But that's what the property, so this is what National Register does and does not do. Now, the things, now we'll get into what I think of as the fun stuff, the things that can and can't be listed. Now, there are 5 resource categories. There are actually more than this. However, these are the 5 that are in the bulletins that are issued by the National Park Service. And the others are not encountered all that often. So you have 5 resource types. You have buildings, districts, structures, sites, and objects. A building, obviously, is created principally to shelter any form of human activity. These are things like churches, schools. These are the most common resource type that springs to mind when we're talking about the National Register. In terms of certified local governments, buildings are generally going to be what the bulk of what is brought to their attention in terms of individual buildings that people believe are historic, but also historic districts. Structures. So the term structure is used to distinguish from buildings those functional constructions made usually for purposes other than creating human shelter. I have two examples here. Bridges and dams just happen to be two of my favorite structure types, but they can also be anything else. It can be helpful to think of them as engineering constructs. Roads, bridges, dams, power lines. There can also be bandstands, irrigation systems, canals, grain elevators, silos, windmills, and my favorite is actually spacecraft. There recently was the Space Shuttle Enterprise was listed to the National Register as a structure. Objects. Objects are not a resource type that we come across very often here in Wyoming. The example on the slide is the Buffalo Bill statue. This is a listed object, but objects can also include things like fountains, sculptures, monuments, statuary. It is used to distinguish those constructions that are primarily artistic in nature. Sites. Sites are the location of a significant event, a prehistoric or historic occupation or activity, where the location itself is what possesses the historic, cultural, or architectural value. The photo on the slide is the Alcova Redoubt site here in Wyoming. It's a prehistoric fortified site. Sites are often used for archaeological resources, so any kind of archaeological site, but also for battlefields, campsites, rock shelters, trails, things of that nature. Now, in the past, cemeteries and designed landscapes like parks have been classified as sites. However, the use of the term landscape has come into more common usage, and those are usually now designated as landscapes. Districts. A district possesses a significant concentration, linkage, or continuity of sites, buildings, structures, or objects united historically or aesthetically by plan or physical development. Most of the districts that people think of are going to be downtown districts or residential district. The photo here is of the Gillette Downtown Historic District. This was recently listed. But there can also be residential districts, such as the Rainsford District here in Cheyenne, as well as the Capitol North District. So, now that we've covered the different types, I should mention that I did not go into detail on landscapes, as this is something that should be really only explored by cultural resources professionals. So, the listing requirements. Now, we went over the different things, the different types of resources that can be listed, but in order for a resource to be listed, it has to meet criteria on two sides. You have significance and integrity. So significance is governed by four main criteria. Criterion A, B, C, and D. These historic significance can be equated with the history or story of building, the who, what, when, where, and why. Integrity, on the other hand, is whether or not the building, or the resource, I should say, actually reflects the significance that it's being listed under. Now, a resource can have association with multiple criteria. I do have one example on the slide that is was submitted to the National Register for listing under 3 of these criteria. It can also be only a significant under 1 criterion. But regardless, it needs to have integrity, which is these 7 aspects of integrity, which I will also cover. And it needs to have a majority of these. It doesn't necessarily need to have all, but it needs to have a majority. And then finally, there are 3 levels for significance. Something can be significant on the national level, the state level, which I also kind of consider to be a regional level, and then local level. So, criterion A. This is one of the more common criteria that is used for listing to the National Register. In order to be eligible under criterion A, a property must be associated with 1 or more events important in the defined historic context. The photograph on the slide is of the Sage Creek Community Club. This was just listed this year. This is significant under criterion A because of its association with the development of the Sage Creek community. When it was constructed in the 1920s, it was a centralizing building for a far-flung ranching community. Dances were held here, governmental meetings, any kind of community event was held in this building, and that made it central to the development of the Sage Creek area. Criterion B is the association with an important person. So, property associated with individuals whose specific contributions to history can be identified and documented. The photograph on the slide is the John Clymer residence. This is the property that I mentioned. It was submitted to the National Register under 3 separate criteria. The house is associated with John Clymer, who was a pretty significant Wyoming artist. He was also significant on the national level. He spent the bulk of his commercial career, as an artist for the New York Post in New York City. He moved to Teton Village in Teton County in retirement and embarked on what is now considered to be his artistic career. He focused primarily on Western art. His paintings hang in museums all over the world. But this was the building out of which his later artistic career primarily took place. All of it, this was his home, it was his studio. He disseminated his paintings to galleries. He donated them for fundraisers and auctions. So the building is associated with him, with his importance, but it is also associated with the development of Teton Village, the growth of the skiing community there in Teton County, which is criterion A. And then under criterion C, this is a beautiful example of mid-century architecture, specifically mid-century mountain resort architecture. Criterion C is the other criterion that people think of when they think of the National Register. Criterion C is used for properties that are significant for their physical design or construction, contain high artistic value, or are representative of the work of a master. The photograph on the slide is of the Federal Center building here in Cheyenne. This building is actually listed under criterion A for developments of government and architecture, and under C for architecture, not only as a beautiful example of brutalist architecture, but also for its association with the architect Frederick C. Porter Sr. This was his last major work, and he is considered a master in this region. Criterion D is information potential. These are mostly going to be archaeological archaeological resources. So these are criterion D is used for properties that have yielded or may be likely to yield information important to prehistory or history. Now, there are 3 significance levels. National is the first one. Properties that represent an aspect of the whole of the history of the United States and its territories as a whole. I have included a photograph here of the Quebec 1 Missile Alert Facility. This is actually now a National Historic Landmark. That program recognizes resources that are instrumental to the history of the U.S. As you may be aware, the Missile Alert Facility represents the missile defense system that was in place all across this region. These were vital to national defense. I should mention that resources with national significance are going to be rare, and generally speaking, the National Historic Landmark designation is usually pursued for these. It doesn't really add an extra layer of protection, but it does raise the profile of the resource nationally. State or regional significance level. These are properties that represent an aspect of the history of the state or territory as a whole. Now, obviously, I have the Capitol building here in Cheyenne. Obviously, this is significant because it is the state capitol. The Capitol building also has an added layer of significance on the national level for its association with the women's right to vote movement. So this is a rare example of something that has both national and state significance. And then local significance. Most properties are going to be, this is listed under the local significance. This is your most common. These are properties that represent an aspect of history of a town, city, county, cultural area, region, or any portions thereof. The photograph on the slide is the WPA building in Gillette. This was just listed to the register this year. This building is significant on a local level because it was the exhibition hall for the local experimental farm. So the local government-run agricultural site that experimented with different types of crops, different irrigation techniques to try to figure out what would grow best in the area and how to grow it as well as possible. All right, so as I mentioned, you can't just have significance, you also have to have historic integrity. So historic integrity is defined as the ability of a property to convey its historical significance. The best way to explain integrity is actually to ask if a contemporary of the time was to see the building, the structure, the site, the resource, would they recognize it for what it is? Does it actually demonstrate the things that it is significant for? Now, I should note that a building can have significance, but no integrity. This is almost always the case when our office says that something is not eligible for the National Register. Many things can have significance, but they don't have integrity. Excuse me. Changes to a building over time can render a building's significance as unreadable. The reverse is also true, although much less common in the Western states. For example, a building can be a perfect, pristine example of a high style of architecture, but in places like the Eastern Seaboard, where that particular design type is a dime a dozen, it doesn't always have significance. So these 7 aspects that are listed here are laid out and defined by the National Park Service. These aspects don't exist in a vacuum, independent of one another. The choice, for example, the choice or availability of materials often dictates the design and vice versa. Location and setting are inextricably linked. Setting is what surrounds the location of the resource. So all of these aspects do combine to create feeling and association. I would like to note that historic integrity is one of those aspects of cultural resources that is unquantifiable, it is subjective, and it can be easily manipulated for purpose. All right, so location. Location is the place where the historic property was constructed, or the place where the historic event occurred. Location is important in understanding why the property was created or why something happened there. For example, a ski lift really only makes sense when it's located on a ski hill. If it were to be moved into a downtown urban setting, it doesn't make sense. It becomes an object of puzzlement. So essentially, a resource needs to stay where it was originally plopped down or built. Now, there are exceptions to this. The exceptions are usually when the movement of the building is part of what makes it significance, or if the building was moved during the period of significance. The picture on the slide here is of Greenfield Village. This was actually Henry Ford created. It was sort of his version of a Disneyland. There are buildings there from across the country, including, I believe, the Wright brothers bicycle shop, where they worked on the first flying apparatus. But the village itself, even though all of these buildings are moved to this location, the creation of it itself is what makes it significant. Excuse me. Another example of a moved property is actually, this is from Fairbanks, Alaska. The church on the screen was actually on the south side of the river. It is currently on the north side of the river, which is what the photograph is of. This photograph was taken not long after it was moved. But the fact that they were able to move it across the frozen river and the mechanism that they used to move it across the river is part of what makes this church so historically significant. Design. So design is the combination of elements that create the form, plan, space, structure, and style of a property. It applies to activities such as community planning, engineering, architecture, and landscape architecture. It includes such elements as organization of space, proportion, scale, technology, ornamentation, materials, structural systems, massing, arrangement of spaces, pattern of fenestrations, textures and colors of the surface material, type, amount, and style of detailing, and arrangement and type of plantings in a designed landscape. So the design of a property also reflects historic functions and technologies, not just aesthetics. The design of a steel through pony truss bridge, for example, is not done for aesthetics, but to ensure that the bridge can carry the weight of the vehicles that will be crossing it. Design is one of the two aspects of integrity that most people do and should get hung up on. It is also one of the most important aspects of integrity to be mindful of when undertaking any kind of adaptive reuse project on a building. This is another example from Alaska. This is what is now the Chena Elementary. When it was constructed, it won national awards. The design, the butterfly roof, which is really not a smart roof type to have in a high snow load area, enabled the roof to be supported by a center building and the exterior walls. This allows the interior walls to be movable. So the interior walls can then be moved around as needed to create new spaces, new classroom spaces, library spaces. It was all done in a manner to make the interior space infinitely customizable. This is an example of design. If the butterfly roof were to disappear or the walls become permanent on the interior, this results in a loss of design integrity. Now, setting. So I did try to pick examples as close as I could from Wyoming. However, sometimes some of these examples are really only or best demonstrated through examples from other areas. So setting is the physical environment of historic property, whereas location refers to the specific place where property was built or an event occurred. Setting refers to the character of the place in which the property played its historic role. So this is actually Fifth Avenue in New York during the Gilded Age, so 1880s, 1890s. This whole stretch of the street was constructed these big, huge mansions. Of these mansions that you see in this photograph, only one remains. But you can see that it is, when it was built, it was in a line of them. And this is where it is now. So as you can see, significant loss of setting. Instead of being one in a row of Gilded Age mansions, now it's sandwiched and squashed between two apartment buildings. As this is Fifth Avenue, I'm sure they're very nice apartments, but they don't have the exterior physical appeal of this, what is now the American Irish Historical Society. Materials. So materials are the physical elements that were combined or deposited during a particular period of time and in a particular pattern or configuration to form a historic property. The example on the slide is the Clinker Stone House. This is a nomination that I'm currently working to complete. What makes this building so significant is the stone construction. The stone is actually clinker stone. This is a type of material that is very specific. It had to do with, it was created when coal beds lit on fire in geologic time. And it's not a common building material at all. So what makes this building so significant is the actual material that it was constructed from. Now, workmanship. Workmanship is the physical evidence of the crafts of a particular culture or people during any given period in time or history. It is the evidence of artisans' labor and skills in constructing or altering a building. It can be expressed in vernacular method of construction and plain finishes, or in highly sophisticated configurations and ornamental detailing. This is the best example of a current nomination that is on the horizon. This is the box cabin located in Teton County. It was put forth for the National Register because of its unusual architecture. The high, steep roof line, in conjunction with log joints, indicate that the builder is familiar with and evoking stylistic features more common to European Nordic countries than to the Midwest. Feeling. So feeling is a property's expression of the aesthetic or historic sense of a particular period of time. It results from the presence of physical features that, taken together, convey the property's historic character. So the example that I have put up here is one of, well, it's actually a home in my neighborhood. This was a tract of homes that was built in the 1950s. These were affordable homes that were built as starter homes. So these homes, as you can see in this one photograph, it just looks like your generic house, but this is Levittown, Long Island, New York. This was the originator of these FHA type homes. These, when you see them all together, instead of being an isolated house that just looks like every other, all of a sudden it feels like a residential area. Feels like Everytown, USA. Association. Association is a direct link between an important historic event or person and a historic property. The property retains association if it is the place where the event or activity occurred and is sufficiently intact to convey the relationship to the observer. I included the Quebec 1 missile alert facility on this slide because it is a resource that retains a high degree of association. This was a missile defense site, and it still reads as such. There is a direct link. The infrastructure still exists. I was out there this summer. You can still go down into the ground, into the bunker there, and get a really good explanation of how these missile alert facilities operated, how the missile defense system operated. So, finally, how is a property listed? The general process begins with a determination of eligibility. This can come about through a federal undertaking. It can come about through requests to our office. Basically, something gets submitted to us. People ask if we think that it is eligible. We help make a determination. Once something is determined to be eligible for the National Register, the next step is to complete the nomination form. I'm more than happy to send you the blank form if you are at all interested. I'm not going to get into the details on that because that's not the focus of this talk. But once the nomination gets completed either by a property owner, an interested party like a certified local government, or more commonly a contractor, a cultural resources professional. Once the form is done, it gets submitted to the SHPO, to our office, specifically to me. I will then read it, go over it, provide feedback, comments, edits, send it back to the author to incorporate those comments and edits. Once that's done, this can go through several rounds. I should mention that. But once it's at a point where our office is satisfied that the nomination form is complete, we submit it to our National Register Review Board, which is made up of volunteers. These are cultural resource professionals from across the state that gather 3 times a year to review nominations. Oftentimes, they will send back a nomination for further edits. And this can go on for quite some time. But once the review board is satisfied, they will vote to pass the nomination, to approve the nomination, at which point I then upload it and submit it to the National Park Service for certification. The goal of all these rounds of edits is to get the nomination form to a state where the National Park Service accepts it without question. I should mention that happens about 50% of the time. A lot of this depends on the author. Using a cultural resources professional to write the nomination is usually going to get you the best results. So then the Park Service reviews and certifies it, and then it gets listed to the National Register. I get weekly updates of the listings from across the country, and I review them every week to see which ones from Wyoming were listed. We just had one listed this last week, in fact. So, pathways to listing. Again, you can do it yourself. Your certified local government, which is you all. You all are the ones that can apply for funding to help hire a professional to write a nomination. A contractor can also write the nomination. And your last ditch is to call me directly to see if I can write it. I really discourage this method of pursuing nominations simply because I currently have a 2-year backlog of resources waiting for nominations to be written. I'm only one person. There's only so much I can do. So the best bet is to hire a contractor and go through the certified local government. And that is the whirlwind presentation on the National Register.